right, as people are coming in here, welcome to our first session of the Friends of the Boundary Waters annual gathering. Tonight's session is about a day in the community. I'll give people, I can see the participants slowly ticking up here. Just a second to jump all online. All right, so tonight's presentations, you might have seen online, this is our night about community. And it's all about the community working together, community coming together. I'm Mike Linneman, Development and Membership Director here for the Friends of the Boundary Waters. And if you don't know who the Friends are, we're a charitable nonprofit, been around since 1976, and our mission is to do three things. We protect, we preserve, and we restore. And what we do on those things is the wilderness character of the Boundary Waters and its surrounding ecosystem from Quetico to Lake Superior. Just as a moose would walk across the borders, we worry about the whole ecosystem protection. And our talks are about the vision, where we envision the future. And this national treasure lies at the intersection of people, communities, and wilderness. So tonight's evening of community is sponsored by Maslin LLP, Dick Kruger, and Chris Ann Kleibacher-Lee. Have the whole presentation in here for our three-day group of events. Our wonderful sponsors here chipping in to help us out. So tonight's three speakers want to go over some basic info for you. If you have questions, which we will have time to answer questions, please put it in the Q&A. You can scroll your mouse down and you can see that Q&A button. Click on that if you, anything of the sort, pop it in there. The chat function, if you want to message something to us privately, just maybe a clarification thing of that sort, you could use that as well. So we'll cover as many as we can, and for ones that we can't, we'll follow up with folks there. So the first presentation that we have tonight revolves around experience a perfect day in Ely, and we have two wonderful speakers there. The first is Tanner Ott, and Tanner is new-ish to Ely, and he and his father have a career rehabbing historic buildings. It's through Alley A Realty, which you might have seen if you've been in downtown Ely more than a few times. They renovate and develop properties, and then they lease them out. Artists, entrepreneurs, restaurants, professionals, really to help communities out, to make things that are empty into more vibrant spaces and really bring back cool buildings with a history instead of bulldozing them. So they're currently working on restoring quite a few Ely buildings, most notably the theater, which is awesome. I've been to it. Can't wait to see a film there. Very thrilled about seeing that. Met up with Tanner in downtown Ely. We had some blueberry pancakes at Insula, as one does. And I mentioned about experiencing the perfect autumn day. We're like, Tanner, would you give a talk on this? And he said, yes, but I'd like some help. What about my friend Lacey? She's phenomenal. And I said, who is Lacey? So got to meet Lacey, and she moved up to Ely from Hutchinson through St. Paul, and her background's in higher ed. So she facilitates opportunities for community engagement and leadership development among college students. So how does that translate to town? Well, she got there 2018 and joined the folk school board, obviously opportunities. And then she regularly contributes to both the Ely summer and winter times, which of course we always got one in the office, got to read through it. And then she works at the Ely Family Dental. So if you chip a tooth on trail, which has never happened to any of us, of course, she'll take care of you after your trip. She and her spouse Eric and their dog Wendell, a little Aussie Shepherd good dog mix, live in the Finn Hill neighborhood of Ely, and they're both really thrilled to talk to you tonight. So without further ado, Tanner and Lacey, take it away.
Thank you, Mike, for such a great introduction. Lacey and I are excited to talk to you about what we consider to be our favorite way to spend an autumn day. I'm fresh out of the Boundary Waters. I just got out yesterday, 5 days of camping. And we are going to talk about the woods and getting out at the outdoors, but we're also going to talk to you about some of our favorite in-town spots.
One fall day in Ely, the perfect fall day, would be a glorious treasure. But really, we could talk for hours and hours. And so we encourage you to spend weeks, months, and cumulative years in Ely and the surrounding wilderness. But let's talk about a Saturday. A picturesque Saturday starts absolutely with WELY Radio 94.5 Polka Saturday. Every Saturday morning, the radio plays a couple hours worth of polka music, and it is a sheer delight. I'm always thrilled when I realize it's Saturday morning, because that means I can run errands around town with the polka music blaring from my car.
You love it or you hate it, and I always like listening to a little bit of it. But the thing that goes great with a morning polka is always your fresh hot coffee, especially if it's a little chillier come September and October. My favorite spot to go is Northern Grounds. They've got everything from the standard cup of joe to your fancy espressos and cortados, and I'm there quite frequently. If you come to Ely, you might see me sitting at a table, and during COVID, they do have some nice outdoor seating on both sides of the building.
Mm-hmm. I can attest to that, because I feel like every time I've ever gone to Northern Grounds, I've run into Tanner there. And so that's always a fun thing about being anywhere in town, especially, you know, as we're talking about community, you can barely go anywhere without running into a familiar face. And that's absolutely something that drew me to Ely and something that I love about it. But so we're talking breakfast. Of course, you can go to Northern Grounds, but I encourage you to check out the front porch. Particularly their quiche is phenomenal. And on any given day when you go there, you can see the folks in the kitchen making the quiche from scratch. And so that's really fun. And then you don't want to miss Britain's either. That is like a quintessential diner. The portions are huge. The coffee is endless. And yeah, those are some must-see breakfast places.
Cash only at Britain. So, and also if you have a big group of people, like 8 or 9 people, you probably want to try to give Britain's a heads up, because it's more of a sit-down restaurant. And they also have outdoor seating, as does the front porch.
Mm-hmm.
So the gotta start my video here so you can see us.
Sorry about that, folks. Hello.
So when you're at some of the places like the front porch or Northern Grounds, you can stock up with some of the cookies and treats and bring them on your outdoor morning excursions. That's what we'd recommend doing in the morning while you have nice sunshine and hopefully some red trees.
Mm-hmm. So if you're familiar with the Ely area, you could either go north up the Echo Trail, where you might find Bass Lake and the Bass Lake hike. So that's a really nice trail, because you can do a full loop that's like 8 miles long, or you can do a 1 mile into this really awesome waterfall, these dry falls that create a sort of natural, almost hot tub sized pool of water for you just to sit and hang out in, maybe in the warmer summer months, but if you're very adventurous, you could go in September. So that's north of the Echo Trail. I always think of that as an intermediate hike. So I went with my family, my in-laws. We were huffing and puffing a little bit. It was an exercise for sure. We felt like we earned some cocktails at the Grand Ely Lodge at the end of that day, but it is a totally doable intermediate level hike. But, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, when you go in to the left, it's great for families too. I have pictures of my family when I was about 4 years old, and we went. And even if you have a nice 60, 70 degree day, you can put your feet in the waterfalls, or even if you're brave enough, swim if you got a sweat going on. So if you do the whole loop, it could take a few hours, maybe 3 or 4. But if you do the short loop, you could do it in just a half a morning. Really nice, great, very popular. And so you will see people, but it is just one of the best spots to go, which is why it's so popular.
Right, you can't beat it. But if you're looking for something that's maybe a little bit more beginner friendly, like when my parents were in town, they were much more comfortable with the Kawashiwi Falls hike. It's 1 mile total, a nice loop. And I say beginner because there's less elevation change, there's less kind of rocks in the path. It's just more user friendly, I would say, for a beginner hiker.
And then the Kawashiwi Falls Trail is just down the Fernberg. So between the Echo and the Fernberg, you've got basically all of your Boundary Waters entry points covered from those 2 roads that exit Ely. Yeah, Kawashiwi Falls, it's a magnificent, it's really overarching. It's a big feature in town. If you haven't been there, which I find so many people that come to Ely don't even know about it. So it's definitely a great thing to do all year round, especially in the fall with the colors.
Absolutely. So maybe you, instead of doing a hike, you want to do a paddle. And the paddle that I think is really essential for all Ely folks to experience is the Hegman Lake paddle to the pictographs. Have you ever been?
I have.
So the pictographs are Native American drawings on rocks, and they are dated, they don't know for sure, but people believe they're anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years old. And there has been Native American occupation of the Hegman Lake area for 9,000 years. And so it's really neat because you get to portage your canoe for a short distance. You can have that portaging experience without really overdoing it. And then the paddle as well is a rather short paddle. So to be able to do something simple, yet have this sort of profound experience connecting to the history of the region is really special.
And I do find too that the Hegman Lake is a great beginning trip at portaging your canoe, because you park your car in the lot. From that point, you throw it on your shoulders and then you walk in, and you could, to go see the pictographs and back to your car is also just a couple hours.
Mm-hmm.
You can mosey around Hegman Lake, have some snacks or bring some stuff to drink and eat.
Mm-hmm.
But it's if you have been to the Boundary Waters on a trip, if you haven't been to the Boundary Waters on a trip, this is a great way to get your feet wet with portaging.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Get your feet wet with portaging. That's nice. Let's say you want to stay in town, or the weather's not suitable to your adventure needs or what have you. Check out the Ely Folk School. Of course, we're a little biased, but the Ely Folk School has a wide variety of classes offered, and they're even pivoting to doing virtual classes to adjust to new needs this year.
And one of the neat things that they've been doing during the coronavirus is online Zoom classes. So Lacey's been teaching some cooking classes at the folk school,
Mm-hmm.
but they are still offering some in-person classes. It's a nice, 5 or 6 people in a course is pretty standard. So you're not in a big group, but the folk school covers things in Scandinavian crafts, Finnish, Slovenian,
Mm-hmm.
Native American. There's lots of all of the ethnic groups that settled in the northern Minnesota near Ely
Mm-hmm.
are represented with the classes that they offer. And so if you're interested in crafting, it's a really great place to meet some fun people and learn some new skills.
I will add something there. So when I first moved to Ely, I moved because my spouse got a job, but I didn't have a job yet. So I was on a self-made sabbatical, which I recommend to anyone who can take that opportunity. But I didn't have any friends, I didn't have a job, and I just generally didn't know anyone. So I took a Cornish pasty cooking class at the Ely Folk School, and that's really what launched me into a ton of community connections in the area. And I'm really, really grateful for that connecting point in town.
And many classes are just 4 hours long or less if they're on the Zoom. Some classes are multiple days, but sort of you can definitely do this in a short weekend if you want to stick in a half day to do a folk school course. Another thing that's great about it is it's walkable to all of the coffee shops and restaurants. It's right in the middle of downtown, across the street from the State Theater. So you're right in the core, and you can drop by, look in the windows, and see what classes they're offering.
Yeah, pencil in the wild rice harvesting classes for next year.
There's another picture of the folk school.
Yeah, they do potlucks, or they have in the past done potlucks, which I have felt was another really great connecting point for community. There was at one point someone spontaneously broke out into song, and it was very delightful. All right, so let's say in your imaginary Ely day that you're planning for next year or this fall, we'd love to see you, stop at Insula for lunch. They have some really great vegan or gluten-free options. And Cary, who's going to speak next, actually told us he's a huge fan of the Northern Pike sandwich, which is very well earned. It's a very delicious sandwich. So the variety of the menu is really exciting, good for large groups who have a lot of different needs. Yeah, recommended.
Yep, and just like Britons, you may want to call ahead if your group is large. And in fact, during coronavirus, the only way to order food is by calling Insula. And a few of the great spots to go once you get your food: Whiteside Park. If you've got kids, they have a nice playground area. They've got some picnic areas that are sheltered from any weather. Seamers Beach is down, what's that road called? Pioneer Road?
Well, it's on Shagawa Road.
West Shagawa
West
Road.
Shagawa Road, which is where I live. And so I'm very biased towards Seamers Park Beach. You can actually take part of the Taconite Trail through a wooded area to get to this huge beach with a ton of picnic areas, some bonfire spots, a park, like a playground, as well as there are some islands that you can access from Seamers Park Beach and go for a hike right here in town.
And not to mention, there's a few tables outside the restaurant as well. If you don't have a lot of time to kill eating lunch and you just want to grab and go, you can hang around the picnic tables and then get your afternoon going. Crapola Granola is the photo on the right. It's a great place to get your after lunch cup of coffee if you need to get recaffeinated. They've got snacks that you can take to your afternoon trips. Crapola is a play on the words cranberry apple granola. They've been around for about over a dozen years. They're going on 13 years now, I believe. And just the great example of a small business entrepreneurial culture of Ely, Minnesota. What started off as sort of a joke at the farmer's market turned into a 13-year business for these guys. And they do other things too besides granola now. They make bread and muffins and scones and cookies.
And the best wild blueberry granola tarts of all time. So when they have them, my office is right next door, and when they have them, we will go sell them out and just, I mean, sorry everyone, but we will hoard them because they are so delicious.
And the everything bagels they've been starting. I don't know if you had those. Those
I
are pretty new. Very good. Homemade bagels in Ely. So there's what I kind of consider the big three of some of the institutions for tourists that come to the Ely area. One of them being the North American Bear Center. They do refresh their exhibits, and if you haven't been to the Bear Center in a few years, there are some new things to see. Depending on what time of fall that you're going to the Bear Center, they might be in hibernation mode. So if you're thinking about going to the Bear Center, you might want to call ahead to see if seeing bears is important to you. You may want to make sure that they're alive and, or not alive, but up and at 'em and moving around.
Speaking of seeing bears up and at 'em and moving around, I was teaching a blueberry pie making class from my kitchen via Zoom on behalf of the Ely Folk School. And I had just been telling participants about how since the blueberry harvest, the wild blueberry harvest wasn't very great this year. We had a really dry June, and the old timers were all saying, oh yeah, there's gonna be a ton of bears in town. Well, then lo and behold, there were a ton of bear sightings in town this year. In fact, my neighborhood has a resident bear, and I was literally cooking up blueberries to go in a blueberry pie when out my window we saw a bear walk past, just 5 feet away from my kitchen. So such is life in Ely. And that's why the North American Bear Center is located in Ely.
And of course, the infamous Dorothy Moulter, who's got a lot of her cabins from her property up on Knife Lake. She was the last person who was allowed to live in the Boundary Waters, and she made root beer, and people donated to her to keep her lifestyle going. If you want to learn more about her, you have to go and learn all about the details, but she was a really, really interesting woman. She came up here in her late teens from Chicago and ended up loving it so much, and she stayed.
And the Dorothy Moulter Museum is a really good community partner. They host a ton of free events throughout the summer when we have more folks in town, and it's really kid-friendly. They often do make your own root beer classes, and so I encourage you just to keep tabs on what they're up to. All right, International Wolf Center. During some parts of the year, you can go on a Friday night and watch them feed the wolves.
And they've got a couple screens for showing films too. So these are great ideas for a rainy day. You may hopefully you've got more than just one day, because like Lacey said at the beginning, there's way too much to fit into a perfect day. But if the weather's not on your side, maybe hit 2 or 3 of these indoor activities. But the Wolf Center, like I was saying, they've got a couple places that screen movies, research films about the wolves. It also has a big window so you can see the wolves indoors, and they've got great exhibits. I thought it was really cool seeing the difference between all the different canines and the skulls and the stuff that they have on display. So they, not to mention the wonderful research that they do here, it's a big asset for the Ely area to have the International Wolf Center here, and it's definitely worth checking out.
And it really is international. They have an international audience, which actually all of Ely does, as I learned when I was working at a restaurant in town. We had folks coming from all around the world, so that was really neat. Just if you've got nothing else to do and you really aren't sure, just go for a drive. My goodness, the Ely Trail, the Fernberg Road, I mean, it's stunning this time of year.
And if you guys are on Facebook, there is a group called What's Up Ely, and you can comment on it and ask questions. One of the things, if I didn't live here and I wanted to catch the fall colors, it would be a great idea to post what's going on with the trees, because if you are really interested in photography or getting some of that orange and red in your experience, then you could sort of communicate with the people that are up here and see when the trees are about to be in that state and make your spontaneous trip to Ely at the perfect moment.
Absolutely. We want to plug Listening Point, but it is closed until further notice. So definitely check out and learn about Sigurd Olsen. But for now, we just want to do one last plug for you're in Ely, you're having a wonderful day. You've had dinner perhaps at the Grand Ely Lodge or the Ely Steakhouse or Boathouse Brew Pub. All good recommendations and options. Before you leave, check out a movie at Ely Historic State Theater.
And if you're really lucky, they might be doing a different, unique event, because it's a movie theater that has been showing blockbuster movies on the weekends, the current releases. But then on the week, they've been doing some independent films. Last week, they did a movie on Gordon Lightfoot, sort of a story of his life kind of movie. And this week, they're doing it on the scientist, their innovator, Tesla. So some really interesting films that are coming through. And then they're doing special events too. They had an opera there. They had a musical there. So
yeah, I would say if you go to the movie, please, it is a nonprofit organization. The State Theater is run by a nonprofit. And so the prices are affordable to see a movie, but you are encouraged to please splurge on some concessions or consider donating so that the Ely State Theater can continue to grow and thrive.
So at this point, we'd like to thank you for listening to what we consider a perfect day in Ely. There are a couple other things that you can do. If you are so lucky to have some connections up here, maybe you'd be able to take a sauna and jump in the lake, which is perfect to do that time of year because it's a little chillier. The steam sauna, which is normally open and for operations, that was going on 105 years. It started in 1915. That is not open this summer because of the coronavirus.
But it'll come back, and it'll come back strong. So check it out sometime in the future.
Yep. So what questions do you guys have?
So I'm checking into these right away here for you, Tanner. There is one that came in hot right away, and it's big groups. Say you got a big group and you're in Ely, you're feeling cider, you're feeling hungry. Anything that would be different for having a full group of 9 in canoes compared to maybe a 2 to 4?
I think it just has to do mostly with managing expectations, because we are ultimately in a small town, right? So we have our service providers, our restaurants would all be happy to serve large groups. It just might take more time. And sometimes in the season, this is still considered the busy season for us. And so a lot of facilities don't do reservations during the busy season. And so certainly you might be able to be a little bit more nimble if you broke your group up into smaller groups. But if you want to hang out as one large entity, absolutely do that. Just know that you might be waiting for a bit before you get a table, or it might take a little bit longer to get your food type thing. That's one consideration.
Tanner's like, yes.
Mhm.
Okay, we have another question here. Good places to stay. Say you've never been to Ely. Where do you stay? Downtown? Do you stay outside? What do you do?
Well, I mean, it's hard to beat this time of year camping because there are no mosquitoes. And so so camping is great. You can get some permits to camp in the boundary waters. There's first come, first serve camping places outside of the boundary waters. There's state parks and within a 20-minute drive. So tons of camping opportunities, as I'm sure most of you know. But, you know, downtown, there's a handful of hotels and motels that you can stay at. And Airbnb is definitely something that many people are starting to use more often in Ely now too.
Yeah, don't overlook Winton either. I mean, there are VRBO vacation rental places regionally. There are some really awesome hotels that have different niche things about them, right? So you can stay in one of the motels that has the super vintage, you know, color TV signs outside, or something with a more modern twist, like the Adventure Inn is, you know, their tagline is about eco-friendly tourism. And I don't want to just, you know, celebrate two organizations when so many of the businesses in town are doing awesome things, but those are ones that come to mind. So definitely camping at like Bearhead Lake State Park, before you go into the woods or something. You have a ton of options. But if you want to come here in like blueberry time, end of July, then you want to start booking early.
And I would think the Harvest Moon Festival, which is unfortunately not happening this year, obviously, but the Harvest Moon Festival is probably also a time where it celebrates autumn in Ely, and if you're coming up then, you definitely want to book in advance. The other thing that you guys may or may not be aware of is that Ely's going on about year 3 or 4 of the marathon, and I do believe it's a Boston qualifying marathon, and it's been really successful and grown a little bit each year. So if that's something that's in your hobbies, definitely sign up for the Ely Marathon. Again, not happening this year, but check again from 2021.
Yeah, you can also, as a spectator or as a runner, you could do the marathon with a canoe.
Portage the whole thing. I have seen people do that, which is...
And people have done it. I couldn't even think about running a marathon.
Yeah.
With a canoe on my back. Wow.
We got a question for you in here, Tanner. On the State Theater, how old is it, and is it historically designated?
Great question. The State Theater was built in 1936. So what is that? Puts it in at 80.
Oh yeah, 85.
84. Going on 85. And it is on the National Register of Historic Places. That was one of the first things we did a few years back. So
got another question in here. Probably have like one or two more here. Once it gets colder, right now obviously it's still, you know, decently warm. Once it gets quite cold, or, you know, right before the snow comes, does anything change in Ely, or things that may shift that people should, you know, prepare for closer to maybe late September, early October, or even late October?
Well, as a resident, I would just say that there's a total shift in the air because the pace of things slow down. And that's what I love about being in Ely at that time of year, because people just take it easy and they go a little bit slower. So I don't know if that's useful or helpful, but I love the vibe, because once you shift into that sort of like denouement of fall, the energy is just so chill. So that's like one of my favorite things.
If you're possibly have a cabin up here and it's starts to be deer season, don't expect any contractors to show up to work on your cabin if you've got work lined up. That's about early November.
Yeah,
So.
and some of those like big institutions that you might consider going to, the Bear Center, the Wolf Center, Dorothy Molter Museum, their hours are going to reduce slowly until they either take a hiatus for a period of time or shut down until next season. So it's definitely worth taking a look at what your priorities are as a traveler and as a guest to the town, and check out people's business hours, because things change that time of year for sure. But I love like I said, the serenity is unbeatable.
Sometimes the menus at like Insula they have a fall winter menu, so you can get some things that are hot off the press.
Whole new cocktail
items.
lineup. Ooh.
Just perfect.
Happy hour at Northern Grounds. That's something that a lot of locals look forward to.
How could we forget? Oh my gosh.
It's only a winter thing.
Yeah, once it goes into that sort of off season, there's a 4 o'clock to 5:30 happy hour at Northern Grounds, and you will just see every single person you know there in the best way.
And one more thing that I'd mention is that a lot of the community is kind of old school in the sense that a lot of people participate in leagues, whether it's darts or pool and all kinds of different things, and people just get together once a week to see their friends and do that kind of thing. And when I lived in other places, that wasn't as prominent of an activity, but it's definitely something that keeps the people in the community here visiting each other throughout the colder months.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Tanner, Lacey, thank you so much for making time out of your day tonight. And obviously you have your masks on. It'll be an interesting thing like a year or two from now when people ask us, why are they wearing masks? So like, well, 2020. So thank you again on that front. We had one little thing come in here with club things. Don't forget your pickleball club league. I know it's important. I've played it. I'm terrible at it, but it is fun. The two of you can both be reached by email. We have the slides up here. Lacey has a wonderful Instagram, which you do see the little dog up there sneak in every now and then. I looked. For folks, you can follow along with them, drop them questions. But thank you to the two of you. We're on to the next.
Yeah, thank you.
So the second part of our annual gathering tonight is we have an author with us. Not just any author, we have Cary Griffith with us. So Cary, in the second part of his life, became an author. And he didn't just have one random self-published book. He's had award-winning books from Lost in the Wild, Danger and Survival in the Northwoods, to Opening Goliath, Wolves in Savage, Minnesota. Very, very good reads. But tonight, we're talking Boundary Waters, community around that happening. And he's going to be talking about Gunflint Burning, Fire in the Boundary Waters. This book, it's all about the community coming together to deal with this, how they reacted, what were the outcomes from it, real deep dive into research and interviews, all of those wonderful things. So for him, make sure that you stick around. We have a giveaway at the end. And please ask him as many questions as possible. You will see a ton of data. You're going to see maps, all sorts of fun stuff. And in that, add it in the Q&A anytime you want. You can do it early, do it late. We'll get to him as many as we can. But without further ado, Cary Griffith, hello and welcome.
Just a minute. Thank you. Thanks, Mike, for that great intro. And thanks, Tanner and Lacey. You make me nostalgic for the North Woods and for Ely, one of my favorite places up on the northern Minnesota area. Tonight, we're going to talk about Gunflint Burning, Fire in the Boundary Waters. As Mike mentioned, I've written a few books, won a few awards, but really, I wanted to focus my remarks on this particular book, my most recent, that came out in May 2018. And I like to kick it off with giving us sort of the bearings of the actual fire that happened. The fire, of course, that the book is about is the Ham Lake fire of 2007. It started on a Saturday, May 5th, and it burned for 13 days. I like this map because it sort of gives you not only geographic bearings, but also historic bearings for the fire. This entire brown area here represents about 76,000 acres that burned in the Ham Lake fire. And it shows you some very important details, one of which is the Gunflint Trail right here that goes up all that way. And you can see it was much of it was consumed in the fire, and much of the structures around it were consumed. But you can also see this is the international border, so a lot of it burned in Canada. And then while this fire happened in 2007, about 10 months earlier, the Cavity Lake fire happened. The Cavity Lake fire burned about 45,000 acres. And at the time, the Cavity Lake was about the largest forest fire in Minnesota in almost a century. Interestingly, these two are slightly related in one specific way. What made the 2006 Cavity Lake fire possible, the 2007 Ham Lake fire, and then the Pagami Creek fire that happened in 2011, a few years later, was the July 4th, 1999 blowdown event that struck the boundary waters and left a huge amount of burnable fuel. And even though we didn't have big fires prior to 2006, people worried about it and still worry about it. There still is fuel left over from that huge event. Okay, so long before I ever thought about writing a book about the Ham Lake fire, coincidentally, my wife and I were up, we were doing a hike of the Magnetic Rock Trail. Some of you probably know, if you drive up to the Gunflint Trail, about 50 miles, you'll find the trailhead for that hike. It's a beautiful hike. But on this particular day, it was about 2 weeks after the fire burned through the area. And I took this picture. And the only thing the phrase I can use to describe this entire area went right after the fire was post-apocalyptic. I mean, it looked terrible. And I felt terrible for all the cabin owners and the resort owners and the people in the area, because I thought the place would be devastated forever. But I also took this picture. This picture shows that just 10, 14 days after the fire, fern fronds are already pushing up out of the ash. And it reminded me of one of the most important aspects of forest fires. There is an ecological benefit to forest fires, and they've been happening, as we all know. I think Myron Henselman and Dr. Lee Frelick, who I'm going to mention in a sec, forestry professor at the University of Minnesota, they have chronicled millennia of forest fires across the boundary waters, and they actually serve a beneficial aspect to the area. For example, jack pine or black spruce have something called serotinous pine cones, and those pine cones don't even open and begin to propagate and spread their seeds until they encounter the heat from a forest fire. So the forest fire has been good. And I'm really comforted now when I drive up to the end of the Gunflint Trail. It's amazing. You can see occasional black snags still from the Ham Lake fire, but the place is green and luscious and growing. Now, I have many people to thank for this book. And as Mike mentioned in the preliminary remarks, really this book is about the community coming together to fight the Ham Lake fire. At one point, there were more than 1,000 firefighters from across the country working on this fire, but supporting them were probably twice as many people, volunteers, people that lodged them, people that made them food. That was the community of the Gunflint Trail and the community of northeastern Minnesota. And I call out more than 60 people in the acknowledgments, and I really owe a huge debt of gratitude. Everybody was very open and wanted to share their stories, cabin owners, law enforcement people, and they were great. And they were instrumental in fighting the Ham Lake fire. Huge community project. Now, when the editor of my first two books suggested I write a book about the Ham Lake fire, I thought that must be because it's the largest forest fire in Minnesota history. So I started doing some research, and I realized when I found this chart, it wasn't the largest forest fire. It wasn't in the top 5. It wasn't even in the top 10. today it's number 12 on the overall list. When it happened in 2007, it was number 11. And this list, by the way, is by number of acres burned. So you can see it wasn't the biggest fire in Minnesota history. However, when I started doing more research, I realized this was a really book-worthy project, and just a couple instances that made it so for me. While it wasn't the largest, it was the largest in almost a century when it happened in 2007. It also, although it says there were no fatalities, I beg to differ. I think there was one fatality from the Ham Lake fire. I'm going to cover that in a little bit. And one of the other things that you notice here is that almost all of these fires, and most fires that happen in the Boundary Waters, start from lightning. This was the only forest fire in northeastern Minnesota that was started by a campfire. And I wanted to know more about that story. What happened to that person who started the fire? Now, by the numbers, this is actually a fire progression map that the U.S. Forest Service put out. The fire started right here in Ham Lake, and it burned, as you can see, almost due west because the winds and the weather played an instrumental role in the Ham Lake fire, and both starting it and fighting it throughout the 13 days it burned. The winds were gusting at 20 to 30 miles an hour coming out of the east-southeast. And you can see this is sort of the shape of a cigar. That wind was so strong, it pushed the fire very fast coming out. Now, the unthinkable happened that night. Now, remember the map I showed you, the Cavity Lake fire happened right here. Everybody, all the firefighters on the scene that day at the start of the Ham Lake fire thought this trajectory for the fire was great, because by the time it got further west and hit the burned up fuel of the Cavity Lake fire, it wouldn't have any more fuel to continue and it would burn itself out. Unfortunately, that night, in a terrible, misfortunate, circumstance, the winds remained strong, very unusual for night for winds to continue strong. It remained strong and it shifted. It began moving and coming out of the due south. So this whole right flank of the fire became the fire front and burned straight due north. And you can see here, this little dotted line here is the Gunflint Trail. That's the second day of the fire, is the day it burned over the Gunflint Trail and actually burned its first structures. Now, by the numbers, it burned 13 days. I mentioned it burned 76,000 acres. It burned 144 structures. The estimated costs were $100 million, and the firefighting costs alone were $12 million. Now, in another episode I cover in the book, is something I can only refer to as truth is stranger than fiction. Dr. Lee Frelich, that I mentioned earlier from the University of Minnesota, he's an expert, boreal forest expert in general, and an expert on the Boundary Waters in particular. By the way, I think Lee is talking to you tomorrow at noon. But Dr. Frelich, the fire started May 5th, and Dr. Frelich put in to Seagull Lake on May 4th, the day before the Ham Lake fire started. He put in with writer Gus Axelson and photographer Lane Kennedy. And they were actually going to do a 3-day portage, paddle and portage, and go across Seagull into Alpine, up around, and go down into Saginaw and end up back at their cars. Unfortunately, the winds were so strong the day they started out, they ended up staying their first night, the 4th, May 4th, on the northwest side of 3 Mile Island on Seagull Lake. And the next day they woke up and the winds were so strong they couldn't get across to the Alpine Lake Portage. And in fact, by mid-morning, they looked down here to the south and they saw the first plumes. Remember, it started May 4th, mid-morning. They saw the first plumes of smoke from the fire, and they realized the fire at that time appeared to be headed almost, the smoke and flames, almost in their direction. So they paddled up here to the Palisades. on Seagull Lake, which was a huge cliff face that sort of gave them some protection against the smoke. And there they sat for the next 2 days because it was so windy. Interestingly, for Dr. Frelich and the others who were writing this article for Backpacker Magazine and doing the photography for it, they had a front row seat on one of the region's iconic forest fires. And it actually passed by them about a half mile to the east while they were stuck in the Palisades. They finally did get out. I tell the story in the book, but it is an interesting anecdote. Now, who was the person that started the fire? Well, his name was Steve Posniak. He was 63, recently retired from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Washington, D.C. You know, this wasn't his first rodeo. This was the 27th year he was headed into the Boundary Waters, and he always did the same thing. He was always outfitted by Tuscarora Lodge and Outfitters. I know many of you probably are familiar with Tuscarora. If you drive about 50 miles up the Gunflint Trail, you turn left on County Road 47, drive down a mile, and you're at Tuscarora. And he always went at the same time every year, the weekend before the opening week of fishing season. So he was familiar with it. He knew all the regulations. He knew leave no trace, for example. You pack out everything that you bring in. Unfortunately, Steve was a news hound and he had a tradition. He would gather up all his paper refuse on the last day of his trip and he would burn it in his fire pit. Now, it's actually a violation of wilderness regulations, but Steve probably looked at it like driving over the speed limit. Now, Steve arrived in the area, I believe, on Tuesday, May 2nd. He spent the first Tuesday and Wednesday. It was kind of cold, and he spent the first 2 days in the bunkhouse at Tuscarora. This is Tuscarora right here. He spent those first couple days at Tuscarora, and then on May 3rd, Thursday, May 3rd, he sat down with Andy Arentz, the co-owner of Tuscarora at the time, and said, okay, Andy, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put in at this entry point to the Boundary Waters, and I'm going to paddle all the way down here to the north arm of Cross Bay Lake. And that's where I'm going to stay Thursday night and Friday night. And then I'm paddling back out on Saturday. But Steve, again, he was 63. He was a little overweight. He'd recently been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. You know, he did this portage, kind of a long, rugged portage. He paddled here, did this next portage. By the time he got to this, there's a campsite here on Ham Lake. Probably many of you have paddled by this campsite. I know I've gone in here and checked it out. It's a beautiful campsite. He decided to stop here. This was far enough. It didn't really matter that he didn't go all the way down here. He would just stick it out. He didn't really expect to see anybody. Unbeknownst to Steve, he stayed there Thursday night, the 3rd. On Thursday, on the Friday, the 4th, 8 U.S. Forest Service Air Resource Management people actually paddled in to the same route. By then, the winds were starting to pick up. Remember, the winds were socking in Dr. Frelich and the others on Seagull Lake. They were picking up here. So the flotilla of 4 canoes came down here and were hit by the wind. And so they paddled down and they stayed at this site right here. Now, when they paddled by, of course, they saw Steve. They saw he had a green Dartmouth sweatshirt on. He had glasses, beard, a big guy. So they could identify him. So sure enough, they make this their base camp. And the next day they wake up and they paddle. The Forest Service people paddle down into Cross Bay Lake. Now, late morning, remember this is Saturday, May 5th. Steve is waking up. He's gonna leave this day, but he's got that tradition. So he goes up to the fire grate and he gets together all his paper and he burns it. And obviously he thinks it's out. Because he's leaving this day, he goes back down to his tent, goes into his tent and starts packing up his supplies. While he's there, the fire gets started. And remember, it's unseasonably warm and the winds are really strong and they drop an ash into the center of that campsite. And by the time he realizes there's a fire in his campsite, he tries to put it out, but it's too far gone. In fact, he's hoping that when it hits that little waterway, it'll be stopped, but the winds are so strong, it kicks it across the waterway, and it actually begins heading straight towards Tuscarora Lodge and Outfitters, about 1.5 miles away from, as the crow flies, from where Steve is camped. Now, Andy Arentz, the co-owner of Tuscarora, is working outside on that day, and he's working with a guy that says, hey, you smell that campfire? Now, Andy was one of those people in the area that was really spooked by the Cavity Lake fire that happened about 10 months earlier. And he knew, because of that fire, he's worried about forest fires, and there are near drought conditions now in May 5th, 2007. But because of that fire, he knows the difference between the smell of smoke from a forest fire and the smell of smoke from a campfire. And he says to the guy he's working with, that's no campfire, that's a forest fire. He goes right down and gets his wife, co-owner of Tuscarora, Sue, to start calling down her phone tree and alerting people. Well, the first thing Sue does is call the Gunflint Trail Volunteer Fire Department. A guy by the name of Mike Prom, co-owner of Voyagers Canoe Outfitters. He's up at the end of the trail, about 12 miles away. Now, Mike, because of that Cavity Lake fire, has been answering a lot of calls. When smoke comes down out of Canada, they have a lot of fires. He calls them phantom calls. So he's been answering a lot of these calls, and he thinks this is just another one. But by the time Mike and his colleague get down with their fire truck, get down to the turnoff towards Tuscarora, they can see smoke, they can see spotting fires coming out in front. And so they know it's the real deal, and they drive up and they begin to evacuate people. Now, in the difference, I think I mentioned the difference, the part of the story is the difference between contemporary forest firefighting and historic forest firefighting. And this is an example of how contemporary forest firefighting differs in a huge respect from the historic ways they used to fight fires. Right after Sue calls the Mike Prom, the volunteer fire department folks, she calls down to the Forest Service office in Grand Marais. There's a fire management officer on duty, Kurt Schierenbeck. He gets the call. He says, okay, we'll check it out. Probably by 11:35, 11:36, he calls the Minnesota Interagency Fire Center in Grand Rapids, who's responsible for dispatching resources to examine fires, to fight fires. MIFC gets the call. They call anytime during fire season, which starts roughly around May 1st. So this was really early in the fire season. There are one of 3 air bases on call. At this particular time, the Brainerd Air Base is on call. And so MIFC dispatches an air attack supervisor by the name of Jody Leadholm. Jody is probably in the air in a sort of a Cessna-like plane to scope out the fire and just check it out. He's probably in the air by 11:40. Say 6-10 minutes after Sue has made that call. That's how quickly they were in the air. Not only was he in the air that quickly, but he brought with him 2 CL-215 Canada Air super scoopers, they call them. They have, their bellies are full of red fire retardant, and as soon as they drop that on a fire, they can scoop down on lakes and fill their bellies full of water and drop it on the fire. Now, as soon as Jody Leadholm gets up on the fire, he realizes what they need to do: build a wall, an arc of red fire retardant between the oncoming flames, the oncoming fire, and Tuscarora Lodge and Outfitters. And as soon as they drop their retardant, the pilots are very skilled. They create that wall, then they drop water, they create a humidity wall. And sure enough, as the fire approaches in late afternoon, it bends around Tuscarora Lodge and keeps heading west. Unfortunately, Tuscarora loses one outbuilding, a remote outbuilding to the fire, and that's the first structure taken in the Ham Lake fire. Now, what happens to Steve? Well, Steve paddles out, and by night he comes back to Tuscarora. Now he can't stay there; he has to be evacuated. But remember, there's a law enforcement officer by the name of Barry Huber. These folks, the Forest Service management folks, are evacuated. They go back to Gunflint Lodge, where they had outfitted out of. And Barry Huber interviews them, and they tell him about who started the fire and where it was. And Steve comes out, and I think he just felt so horrible about it. Remember, he loved the Boundary Waters, that he prevaricated. And he said, well, no, I was down in the north arm of Cross Bay Lake. But Barry Huber, the law enforcement officer, knew this was their guy. He tried to take Barry's picture. His camera failed, so he found out where Steve was staying the next day, and he went down in the morning. He talked to Steve. He goes, his camera fails. He goes down to the to meet Steve at his hotel room in Grand Marais. And the first thing he does is he reads Steve his Miranda rights. And as soon as Steve hears this, he knows it's serious. He's not going to prevaricate any longer. He says, yes, it was me. It was an accident. It just got away from me. And nothing really happens for about, the fire is fought. And I want to mention here that, again, most of my book is about the community effort to fight this fire and how many people came together. And the way I write it, I try to put people in the smoke and the flames and put people on the ground when it's actually happening. And it's really stunning to me how many people came together to help in this endeavor. But however, Steve played a key role, and it was kind of a dramatic story, so I tend to cover it in my presentations. So sure enough, about 18 months later, a grand jury hands down a 3-count indictment. Now, I didn't know this, but if you're convicted of a felony, you can be held liable for damages. And remember, damages were $100 million, and the firefighting costs alone were $12 million. So it had to be weighing on Steve's mind. So through the fall, there are a series of judicial filings. The last one his attorney, Mark Larson, files is an effort to get all 3 counts of the grand jury indictment dismissed. It fails, and Steve, I think, so distraught, the next day died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Now, I never heard anyone that I interviewed blame Steve Posniak for the fire. He did start it, technically, but it was totally an accident. And I think most people I talked to echoed Sue Prom, the co-owner of Voyager Canoe Outfitters, her perspective. It could have happened to anyone. The person responsible for this fire didn't try to start it. It just happened. Again, when I do these presentations in person, I usually give away a book, but listeners, astute listeners, have to work for it. Now, I know I'm talking to a lot of really bright people tonight, so these questions are true, false. I'm just going to read the 3 of them off. And whoever gets the answer to all 3 questions is in running to win a free book, and I have a way to choose that person if I'm in the house, but unfortunately tonight we'll have to do it randomly. But these are the questions. Only 4 structures were lost in the Ham Lake fire. True or false? I'm sure all of you said false. Second question, the Ham Lake fire burned approximately 76,000 acres. True or false? I'm sure everybody said true. Yes, that's exactly right. And the Ham Lake fire was the largest forest fire in Minnesota history. True or false? False. It was the number 12 in the overall history. Now, I want to say that Mike earlier shared a name drawn at random from the audience, and it is, drum roll please, it is Susan Grove. So I will be getting your address, Susan, and I will be sending you a hard copy version of Gunflint Burning shortly, sometime this week. Thank you, everyone. Mike, do we have any questions?
Oh, yes, we do. Of course we do. We've got a great one here for you. And before I get into the questions, and I want to give people a couple seconds here to have in there, I have to make one notice. Obviously, tomorrow morning sessions about the proposed Polymet mine, sponsored by John Gappa, Ron Sternall, Alan Tomets, and we'll have our lead attorney, Evan Nelson of Maslin, to explain what's going on there in protecting the Superior watershed and the precedent for the Twin Metals mine. So that's the first thing. We're going to be at noon tomorrow. We're going to have another conservation award. Wonderful to place there. For people that want to get a hold of you, obviously they can email you. We have all of your social media pieces right here. Susan Grove, obviously, is here. Of course she is, and she's going to be reading your book. Hopefully you sign it, Cary. I'm assuming you will. It's great. Questions. Let's get to those right away here. What is your opinion regarding if there needs to be more proactive controlled fire that will maybe result in less uncontrolled destructive fires?
It's a great question. And coincidentally, before the Ham Lake fire started in 2007, the Forest Service had actually put out a calendar of where they were going to do prescribed burns. That's what they call them. And I think prescribed burns make nothing but sense. They have to be done carefully. They have to be really controlled. But I do think they make sense. I think part of the problem, I think, was for years we got very good at suppressing fire. And I think fire, as I mentioned before, is just a natural part of the forest, and it has to happen, but hopefully in a controlled way.
Okay. All right. Next question we got up here is, how many people did you interview for your book? And what's the average time you spent on each interview?
I probably interviewed, I'm sure I talked to more than 100 people, and probably 45 to 60 minutes an interview. I mean, obviously, I thanked people that were mentioned in the book and stuff. So in the acknowledgments, there's about 60 people I think I mentioned. But yeah, I spoke with quite a few. You have to write a book like this.
Right, that makes sense. All right, well then there's a question on, well, is this it? Well, are you going to continue your research? Is there another book? Is there a sequel? Like, what's coming on this topic?
There isn't a sequel, but I do have an idea for 3 books, and what I am currently calling sort of a prequel to the Ham Lake fire. Remember, I mentioned the Ham Lake fire burned as intensely as it did, and Dr. Freilich will tell you this too, in large part because of the July 4th, 1990 blowdown event. In fact, Cavity Lake, the Ham Lake fire, and Pagami Creek were all in part such intense fires because there was so much burnable fuel on the ground from that seminal event on July 4th, 1999. In fact, I've already begun writing parts of that book, and I'd love to hear from anybody in the audience who may have been in the Boundary Waters during that event or in some other way impacted. If you were, please reach out to me. I'd love to interview you and talk to you about it, and I really appreciate that.
Okay, so we have one on other books in the pipeline. Can you give us a preview of any variety, Cary?
Yeah, I also write fiction. And I've got 4 novels coming out. I've got the 2 novels coming out next spring, which are actually re-edited versions of my first novel, Wolves. It's going to be Wolf Kill. And my second novel, Savage Minnesota, is going to be The Cat's Paw, tentatively. And then I've got 2 more novels coming out after that, all published by Adventure Keen, the publisher that published Wolves. But thank you for that question. I appreciate that.
That's a good one here. So that's what I see for questions. We have one more slide for tonight, which is, for both Cary and myself here. And that is really just to let you know, on our community evening session, we're able to continue this protection work, this preservation work, this restoration work due to you viewers. If you'd like to hear, if you like what you heard, want to hear more things of this sort, want to protect the Boundary Waters, head on over to our website, and that's friends-bwca.org/donate. Real easy to figure out. You can chip in for a membership, be part of our regular communications, receive Pete Marshall's wonderful newsletter 4 times a year where he goes in depth, which we've talked about Gunflint Burning as well. So with that, thank you everybody who came in tonight. We really appreciate you. We hope that you can get in for the next 2 lunch sessions, the next 2 evening sessions. Cary, it's been a delight. Let's have you again back soon.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care, everybody. Have a great evening.